and welcome back for our next video in APUS history. Today we are going to be tackling topic 3.3, Taxation without Representation. I'm your APUSH Lady Boss, and I'm glad you're joining me today. Click down in the description if you would like to grab some guided notes to help you take effective and succinct notes on this lesson while we go. So, as always, we got to remain focused on the learning objective. Explain how British colonial policies regarding North America led to the Revolutionary War. So this is all about causation today. We're looking at the path towards independence. So there are quite a few bullet points in the curriculum framework. So make sure to take some time to review those. But we're focusing on the struggles in the 18th century, both the struggles created by the British Empire with the new taxes and the colonists trying to assert their sovereignty. We see calls for resistance based on Enlightenment ideals. We see various groups of people participating in the independence movement. And we see a strong patriot organization develop to support the war effort. So we've got quite a detailed outline here today. Lots of important things going on. So this is why it's so important that you're making sure to take really specific notes as we go. So what's the historical context that you need to be aware of? Well, it's really the 7 Years' War. This is the first lesson of Unit 3, and it's where we start to see the shift in the relationship between Britain and the colonies. It's what we call a turning point or a watershed moment in American history. So really what happens as a result of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, is that Britain is going to have expanded territory in North America, which will lead towards great debt for Great Britain. In fact, from the years before the war to after the war, the debt of the treasury doubles. We have the end of salutary neglect because of that. So salutary neglect was how the British Empire was essentially ignoring its own economic policies like the Navigation Acts, and they're no longer going to be able to do that. And then we also see the increased conflict with American Indians as a result of Pontiac's rebellion. And so because of that, the British are going to implement their first new regulation in this era, and that is going to be the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibits the Americans from moving past the Appalachian Mountains. So some basic colonial characteristics to pay attention to is that there is the significant post-war prosperity, but that is unevenly distributed amongst the citizens, and there's some general optimism within the colonies. Additionally, 60% of the population is under age 21. So you can think about how that would impact this colonial movement. Young people tend to be more willing to engage in risks, like an independence movement. They also feel less connected to the British Empire. There's a variety of other things that having a young population could impact. Those are just a couple ideas. So we're going to start with this time period from 1763 to 1766, where we see the seeds of discontent brewing. In this time period, there's no one really asking for independence. There's simply frustration with the British Empire. So as we mentioned, the Proclamation of 1763 is going to prohibit that movement out to the Appalachian Mountains. And then we see the first taxes begin. So we have the Revenue Act, also known as the Sugar Act. And that is not only going to implement new taxes, but it also is going to begin to enforce the Navigation Acts. The Quartering Act is going to require the colonists to feed and house British soldiers. The Stamp Act is going to require official documents to have a tax paid and the stamp on them. This is the first direct tax, whereas the other ones were taxes on imported goods, which mostly would have been paid by the merchants. And that will be repealed. And then when it is repealed, Britain is going to pass what's called the Declaratory Act, where they say, yes, we are repealing the Stamp Act. However, we have the right to do this if we want to. We have the right to pass taxes if we want to, even though we're not. So the colonists pretty much just ignored that one. So how did the colonists respond to these acts? Well, or I should say, how did they view them? The colonists believed that they were a huge threat to their liberty And they had their own governments. They had their own assemblies. Those assemblies should have been in charge of the taxation. And so it was challenging their self-government. However, the British believed that these taxes were justified. The debt was because of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. Therefore, the colonies should pay their fair share. It was in protection of the colonies. And so you can see how those points of view may not be enough to ask for independence, but definitely show some conflicting tensions here. So the colonists resented these stricter economic policies, especially the Stamp Act, as it was the first direct tax. And so what they do is they begin to have calls for no taxation without representation. And what I want to emphasize here is that it's not no taxation, period. They're not saying we won't pay taxes. They're just saying we must consent. We must have representatives act on our behalf. And so they form the Stamp Act Congress, and they are going to issue a declaration. They're going to resolve that only their own representatives have the legal authority to approve taxes. Here's an example of the Virginia resolves of those Stamp Acts. This was written by Patrick Henry. Resolved that the taxation of the people by themselves or by persons chosen by themselves to represent them, who can only know what taxes the people are able to bear and the easiest mode of raising them, and are equally affected by such taxes themselves, is the distinguishing characteristic of British freedom, and without which the ancient constitution cannot subsist. So emphasizing that idea of no taxation without representation. Additionally, at this time, we start seeing the beginnings of protest groups. So the Sons and Daughters of Liberty are going to be two groups that develop, aiming to intimidate the tax agents who are supposed to be implementing these new policies. And they also are going to be protesting British policies. So sometimes those protests may turn violent, but the most effective form of protest was boycotts. And this was really organized by the Daughters of Liberty. Often this group is overlooked in the history of the Revolutionary War, but this was an essential component to the effectiveness of getting some of these acts repealed. So women would make their own clothes. It was called homespun. So they would make their own clothes instead of purchasing goods from Britain. They would do other things as well. Women were the primary purchasers for the households. And so if there was a boycott in place, it was up to them to make sure it was adhered to. And so the effectiveness of these boycotts was really implemented by these Daughters of Liberty. So here's a basic timeline of where we're going next. We've got 1767 to 1774, where we really see the beginnings of the revolution, where we see British actions and colonial resistance repeated, and it seems to increase in intensity over time. So we're going to go through each of these things next. So first we want to go to the Townshend Acts. So after the Stamp Act was repealed, there still needed to be revenue coming into Great Britain. And so what is passed is the Townshend Acts, and these are going to be taxes on paper, tea, glass, a variety of things. And the colonists are going to initially accept them, but leaders, including John Dickinson, James Otis, Sam Adams, they fueled the colonial discontent by once again reinforcing the need for consent. Here's a quote from one of the letters that John Dickinson wrote. Upon the whole, the single question is whether the Parliament can legally impose duties to be paid by the people of these colonies only for the sole purpose of raising a revenue on commodities which she obliges us to take from her alone. Or in other words, whether the Parliament can legally take money out of our pockets without our consent. If they can, our boasted liberty is but a sound and nothing else. And so as a result of letters like these, we see boycotts increasing. And as the tensions rise, Britain is going to send additional troops to Boston. So Britain is going to get a new prime minister who's going to urge the repeal of the Townshend Acts. These acts are repealed and then the boycotts end. However, they are going to keep the tea tax. And it's important to note that there are still tensions that are going to go on. Just because they repeal a tax doesn't mean everything is magically over. And the reason behind this is that there are still British troops being quartered in people's homes. If we look at just the population of Boston, that was a population of 16,000, and 2,000 British troops were being quartered in this city. So on March 5th, a skirmish is going to break out. There's harassment, insults, snowballs, all kinds of things. And it's just a group of colonists against one lone British soldier. And he's going to call for reinforcements. They arrive. Differing reports happen next, but as many as 300 to 400 people were there. A shot is fired, and 5 people are killed, 6 are wounded. Crispus Attucks, who was a formerly enslaved person, is considered to be the first person to die in the Revolution, and he was killed here at the Boston Massacre. The soldiers will be arrested, they will be defended and actually acquitted based on self-defense, which is only going to continue to fuel the discontent that is happening in 1770. So here's the most famous image of the Boston Massacre. You've likely seen it before. This was created by Paul Revere, and it looks very one-sided. This would be an example of what we think of with propaganda. And you can see how violent it appears. You can notice that it looks like there's a general actually ordering the shot. And so this really was a huge moment for increasing the opinions of the colonists against Britain. Now, this is an image that was created later based on more of the accounts, and this is more likely a more accurate portrayal showing violence and chaos, and really no one particularly completely at fault here. Okay, let's move on to what happens next. We've got the formation of the Committees of Correspondence, which are going to be letters that are exchanged regarding British activities. Also in 1773, there's going to be what's called the Tea Act. A lot of people think this is a tea tax. It's not. It actually is going to lower the cost of British tea, but it keeps the tax. And this is to incentivize or push colonists to buy the British tea rather than continue smuggling in the Dutch tea that they were doing to avoid the tea tax. The colonists feel that this is manipulation. They continue to buy the smuggled Dutch tea, and eventually what happens is the Boston Tea Party. This is where a group of Bostonians disguised as Mohawk Indians, they dump 342 chests of tea into the harbor. And this is really a catalyst, a moment where we see a real spike in the tensions, especially for Boston. So when the king finds out about this, he says this quote, "We must either master them or totally leave them to themselves," really recognizing that the authority, it needs to be determined who is the authority here. And the king believes it is him in Parliament. So what happens next is punitive acts. The colonists called them the Intolerable Acts because they cannot tolerate them. However, Britain called them the Coercive Acts. They're trying to coerce or trying to get the colonists to behave in a certain way. And so there's a variety of components to these acts, but one is going to be to close the port of Boston and all trade will be prohibited until the tea is paid for. It's going to reduce the power of the colonial assembly and increase the power of the royal governor. Royal officials who are accused of crimes will now be tried in Britain instead of the colonies, and it's going to further expand the quartering of troops in all the colonies. So around this same time period, we have a woman named Phyllis Wheatley. Now, Phyllis Wheatley was enslaved, but she learned to read and write. And one of the things that she did was she wrote amazing poetry. She is known as one of the poets of the Revolution. She was well known in both Europe and the Americas. She writes this letter about some of the events that are happening in 1774 particularly. She's writing this letter to a reverend. "I have this day received your obliging kind epistle, and I am greatly satisfied with your reasons respecting the Negroes, and think highly reasonable what you offer in vindication of their natural rights, the glorious dispensation of civil and religious liberty, which are so inseparably limited that there is little or no enjoyment of one without the other. Otherwise, perhaps, the Israelites had been less solicitous of their freedom from Egyptian slavery. I do not say that they would have been contented without it. By no means. For in every human breast, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. And by the leave of our modern Egyptians, I will assert that the same principle lives in us. This I desire not for their hurt, but to convince them of the strange absurdity of their conduct, whose words and actions are so diametrically opposite. How well the cry for liberty and the reverse disposition for the exercise of oppressive power over others agree. I humbly think it does not require the penetration of a philosopher to determine. So what Phyllis Wheatley is saying is there's all this talk of liberty and freedom, which is natural. It is natural to desire that. That is inside every person. But are these revolutionaries, are they recognizing the hypocritical nature of their calls for liberty and their enslavement of African Americans? So what we see happening is the development of the First Continental Congress. The passage of the Intolerable Acts pushes some Americans just to desire independence. And so the First Continental Congress meets, and their goal is to respond to the threats. And at this point, they still are not asking for independence. Rather, they would like to restore the relationship to Britain. So they come up with these 4 things here. First is the Suffolk Resolves. They require that Britain immediately repeals the Intolerable Acts, and they begin military preparations just in case a battle might break out. They also urge the king to address and fix the colonial grievances, and they, as a conciliatory measure, recognize Parliament's authority to regulate commerce. They also begin an association, a group of committees to enforce the economic sanctions, the ban on trade. The colonies are going to call for a ban on trade against Britain. And they're going to declare that colonial rights were not recognized, and they want the delegates to meet again in May of 1775. So here's where we see a quote, the famous quote by Patrick Henry. Gentlemen may cry peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. So by 1775, we are seeing calls for independence grow. And so we see some violence beginning to occur in the colonies. And the first violence is going to happen in Lexington and Concord. And so both colonists and British troops are spying on each other, and the British troops are aware that there's colonial military supplies in Concord, and some of the Patriot leaders are located in Lexington. And so the British are headed to Concord to grab the military supplies. The colonial militia meets them in Lexington, and this is where the shot heard round the world occurs. However, the first true battle occurs. It's called the Battle of Bunker Hill, but it actually occurred on Breed's Hill. And this is where the British successfully overtook the hill, removed the colonists from from where they were kind of barricading. But the British had significantly more casualties than the Americans. And so even though the Americans lost their position, it was a significant morale and confidence boost for them. So here is a painting of this. And you can see the colonist position would have given them a pretty big advantage here in this battle. After this violence occurs, the Second Continental Congress meets beginning in May of 1775. And this is where they declare that it's important to take up arms. They appoint George Washington as the commander-in-chief. They begin to organize a Navy and Marine Corps. In July and August, they kind of do the opposite, however. They seek peace. They send what's called the Olive Branch Petition to King George III, where they say, we are still loyal. Let's not let this go any farther. Let's fix this. But the king dismisses the plea and issues what is called the Prohibitory Act, which declares the colonists to be in rebellion. All of this concludes the rising action up to the Revolutionary War with the Declaration of Independence. So 5 delegates are chosen to draft the statement, including Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. It includes the grievances and the justifications for revolutions. It's actually on July 2nd that the Congress adopts the Revolution for Independence, and July 4th, they adopt the Declaration of Independence. And here's probably the most famous excerpt from the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So, last topic here. Shots have been fired. Independence has been declared. What are the perspectives of the colonists? Well, we have 2 major groups. We have the Patriots, we have the Loyalists. Patriots are going to be those who rebel against Britain and will be about 40% of the population, whereas Loyalists are going to remain loyal to Britain and will represent about 20 to 30% of the population. The rest of the population was neutral, undecided. And as you can see here on the list, it did kind of depend on your region, your job. There are a variety of factors that would have made a person a loyalist or a patriot. But a couple of the important groups to identify are going to be American Indians and African Americans. So American Indians were most likely going to side with Britain. And a huge reason for that is going to be because of the Proclamation of 1763. They believed that Britain would protect their land and their prior agreements, whereas the colonists would not. And so they were more likely to fight with the British or support the British effort. Now, African Americans are going to be divided. Some African Americans viewed the British as potential liberators, and so they fought with the British in the war, whereas some African Americans saw the connection, like what we talked about with Phyllis Wheatley's letter, that they saw that the revolution could be an opportunity for freedom, and so they fought with the Americans. This is going to be continued on. We're going to talk about this more in lesson 3.5. So stay tuned for more on the Patriot movement and Loyalist opposition to the war. But this was a long one. If you are still with me, thanks for hanging in there. I hope this video is really helpful for you for explaining how British colonial policies regarding North America led to the revolution. And thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.